brilliant. I managed it. Okay, cool. So yeah, thanks for joining, everyone. My name's Chloe. I am a PhD student from Bournemouth University, but I've also a lecturer there as well for the past, for this academic year. So I started in September. So my background's actually psychology, but also I'm a nutritionist too. This is completely unrelated with my PhD, which is obviously more sort of a psychology basis. But yeah, I am a nutrition lecturer at Bournemouth University. I was also a SMaRteN network student researcher a couple of years back as well. So that's how I got involved in the SMaRteN network. But yeah, I must admit, since maternity leave and then teaching, I haven't really been able to come to these sessions, but they're so helpful, and I really do enjoy engaging with them when I can. So yeah, I know a lot of people in the SMaRteN network, and it's always been such a great support for me throughout my sort of PhD experience. So thank you for having me. But today I wanted to talk about my paper that's recently been published, which Jo did send out. It's called Exploring the Wellbeing and Resilience of Postgraduate Researchers. So an overview of my sort of PhD project that is kind of unrelated to the paper, but it is. But my PhD itself was a case study on Bournemouth University. So it was a fully funded studentship funded by the university to sort of have a look at what on earth is going on with the sort of poor mental health and low well-being of their postgraduate research students. So I conducted a sort of 3-phase approach to have a look at this, and they really wanted some output, some sort of interventions, sort of things put in place to try and support students at Bournemouth University. So firstly was an assessment phase that I conducted, and that was a survey and a series of interviews, so a mixed methods approach to really explore, really sort of open-minded. I didn't really have any sort of preconceived ideas about what was going on, you know, what are the factors that are most affecting the well-being of postgraduate researchers. And then I took those ideas forward, and throughout the process I've you know, included PhD students and PGR students from Bournemouth University in every phase of this project. So what I did was I sort of gathered those findings from the assessment phase all together, and then with a group of PGRs from BU, I did some focus groups, and we developed together some ideas based on the findings, based on the literature, and based on, you know, the experience of those in the focus group. We developed a few little interventions that we thought might help. So the third phase was implementing these interventions, and this was in the absolute height of COVID in 2020, which was a little bit of a shame. So all of these things I implemented were online. So I did a series of sort of really small kind of workshop-based interventions. One was based on a series of mindfulness workshops. One was project management workshops. That was kind of something that we identified as something that people really struggled with. And then a series of sort of, we called it mental health mentoring. So luckily my supervisor in his professional background is a mental health nurse, and he ran this series of mentoring, group mentoring sessions related to sort of the PGR experience and mental health. And the fourth thing I did was on our virtual learning platform at Bournemouth University, I set up a peer support area there, and we put up loads of sort of videos and interviews and things with each other and me and various other PGR students about the experience. And we created a forum with those resources, with the resources from the little mini discrete interventions, and just a place that where people could chat, and there was discussion boards and content and things on there. So I sort of ran that as well, but not irrelevant, but not really relevant to the paper. So back to this phase one, this assessment phase I did that sort of underpinned it all. The survey I did with BU students, Bournemouth University students, and then the interviews with Bournemouth University students. But what this paper about is how I actually sent this survey out as well to PhD students across the UK as well. Although it's not really forming part of my thesis, which is a case study, yeah, this paper was a really nice comparison for me to use about what's going on in the rest of the country as well. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So yeah, it's 50 UK students, and yeah, I just thought it was really important to separate from that sample of Bournemouth University students, because obviously it would have been extremely biased if I were to include them all together, because 54 of them were from Bournemouth University. So I chose to publish this in the Journal of Further and Higher Education, and it's kind of because, although obviously it's based on mental health and well-being, but well-being more so, I decided not to sort of try and publish it in a more sort of psychiatric psychology kind of journal, because I think the recommendations are probably most useful and pertinent for people working in the higher education sector and working with PGR students. So that kind of underlies my choice of choosing a more sort of education-based journal to publish that in, and it meant that I kind of tailored the recommendations to sort of fit more with the education context and what people in higher education can do to support these PGR students. So here it is. It was myself and my supervisors and a friend, Orlando Harvey, Dr. Orlando Harvey. She works in social work. And yeah, she was the one that really encouraged me to write this up for publication. You know, you've got so many things going on, you know, when you're trying to pull your PhD together. And she was like, look, this needs to get published. You need to get this done so you can sort of include it in your thesis. So she said she'd help me. And yeah, so, you know, it's about PhD friends. That's a friend that I made on my PhD turned into sort of a lifelong friend and colleague now. So that was a really fun experience for me. So obviously, we're all aware of the challenges facing, you know, student mental health, but obviously a lot of the research really focuses on the undergraduate student. So yeah, with postgraduate students and postgraduate research students in mind, a lot of the research focuses on the things that, you know, affect mental health. A lot of it is focused on supervision, because obviously supervisor, your central support resource, and there's obviously like landmark paper by Levesque in 2017 really highlighted this link between poor supervision, increased stress, psychological distress, and other papers have highlighted this sort of exhaustion, burnout, attrition, and obviously the development of mental health problems too. The thing is, in the UK, UK CGE are really trying to sort of make a change here, but at the moment there is a kind of lack of this framework, standardized framework for what makes a good supervisor. And, you know, mostly universities do offer their own kind of training and selection processes, but across the board, there's not a really standardized process for the selection and training of supervisors. So a lot of them feel they're kind of learning through experience. Personal factors that come into play with the mental health of PGRs: work-life balance, financial concerns, career uncertainty, imposter syndrome is a massive thing, and Nicola's written a paper on that in about, I think it was 2020, she published that. And social support is really key, can be a really lonely experience, and we know that peer support can really promote academic success in PGRs too. I want to touch upon measuring mental health and well-being, and this is a real sort of challenge, because there's just such a range of terminology that's used to describe mental health and well-being, and there's a massive range of scales as well. And yeah, there's a danger here with, you know, the sort of use of the words mental health and well-being being sort of conflated, is that we can sort of pathologize academic stress into sort of a mental health problem, and then yeah, we really need to sort of decipher between mental health problem and the well-being that we all have that can fluctuate. And yeah, in previous research, the conflation of this terminology and the lack of consistency in the kind of tools used to collect the data is a really big issue. So that was a systematic review there by Hazel and Berry and others, that was a really key one that's sort of in the sort of field of PGR mental health, and they expressed this. They're saying, you know, we can't aggregate the existing data as it is because everyone's used different scales, and there's a real need for us to sort of, you know, use kind of more standardized scales and be really clear with our sort of terminology here. So that's why in my paper I just used the word well-being. Obviously in the introduction I discussed mental health, but in my paper and in my PhD I'm really clear about that. I'm not really looking at students that have mental health problems. I'm looking at the well-being that we all have and how we can sort of support that. Therefore I use the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. And Alison Dodd and her team wrote a paper about that recently, about how that is a really good scale and is recommended for use in student populations. So that's why I use that. Resilience is not something that has been looked at in PGRs before from any of the literature that I found. That was a really important concept that I wanted to sort of bring in there. Resilience has been sort of, there's a lot of you know, kind of interventions that have been used to promote student resilience. There's loads of sort of ad hoc courses that university offers to increase resilience as well. So it's obviously something that's really important in student mental health. So I use that Connor-Davidson resilience scale, which is a really widely used and sort of widely accepted scale. So study aims were to assess the factors relating to the PGR experience that affect wellbeing and resilience, and then I wanted to compare resilience and wellbeing levels to population samples, so sort of the general population. As I mentioned, this was a survey and it did have an open-ended question at the end, which allowed me to sort of collect some qualitative data so that people could speak about their experience in their own words, and I thought that was really important. So yeah, sort of mixed methods integration, but obviously more of a quantitative focus there. And these are the scales I use. Obviously I've described the Warwick Edinburgh and the CD risk, but I also use this Juniper PhD wellbeing scale. I don't know whether many of you have heard of it. It was designed by an author called Juniper back in 2012, and this was in UK PGRs that it was designed. It's really long. It hasn't been used loads before, as you know, literature reviews have sort of identified. It's not been used a lot since, to be honest, but review papers have sort of advocated its usefulness. And what I really liked about it, even though it was really long, has these 7 domains, and it kind of allows you to pinpoint which factors most affecting the well-being of PGRs. So really interesting. So this is kind of what it looks like. You have this massive, and I mean really massive, list of things that could potentially annoy you about the PGR experience, and then you rate how important or bothersome, and the word bothersome I found really odd as well. It's not really a word that's used very often, but how important or bothersome it was to you. And the findings. So the findings were kind of as expected. The Warwick Edinburgh scale and the CD risk scale, in comparison to the population samples that I took, I didn't compare the PGRs to student samples. I compared them to the general population samples, and wellbeing and resilience both significantly lower than the population averages. So this sort of highlights that these PGR students in the UK, their wellbeing and their resilience is lower than the sort of expected averages. And the 3 highest rated domains on the Juniper scale were you know, the things that had the most impact on wellbeing were health and home, research and social. And the lowest scoring domain was facilities, according to that. And these are the top rated items, and you'll see that all these health and home factors. So lacking confidence in your ability, high levels of stress, high workload, sort of work-life balance, poor sleep quality, persistent low mood because of your research. So these seem to be the leading factors. But what I found really interesting, why aren't supervisors appearing on there when all the existing literature really points towards them being the sort of instigator of, you know, this poor well-being that PhD students can experience. And I've kind of thought a lot about that. but whether it's because obviously a lot of the research that we have to date, obviously since the HEFKE funding back in 2017, there's a lot of increasing research interest in the UK, looking at UK PGR students. But before that, a lot of the research was international. Whether the UK students had better supervision, because obviously in the PRES data that we get every year, PGR student satisfaction with their supervisors in the UK is actually quite high, it sits about 86% satisfaction. So whether there is this disparity between UK experience and international student experience of supervision, or the scale, the Juniper Wellbeing Scale, is just not asking the right questions about supervision. And I think that might be more the answer here, because when I went on to look at the qualitative responses in the UK students and in my BU students, supervision was still such a key theme and the thing that was probably discussed most. So that's my answer to that. So moving on to the qualitative, this is my thematic map that I created. Obviously I use thematic analysis, it's my favourite. And these were the main themes. I had supervision, expectations, support, coping and balance. And I'll just sort of whiz through them briefly because I don't want to talk for too long. But yes, although the scale revealed that supervision wasn't the sort of leading factor affecting mental health, well-being even, it was discussed a lot in the interviews. So we had stuff about, I think a lot of it was this role of the supervisor in providing emotional support and reassurance. That's kind of what people really wanted. They wanted this like encouragement and validation in what they're doing is good. And then some of them were sort of commenting on this lack of academic expertise that the supervisor had, which obviously would be a sort of big issue. This person said, I just don't think my lead supervisor was selected based on their expertise, and this had a negative effect. Supervisors are vital and play a big part in affecting your well-being, and the biggest issue for me was that the supervisors were not specialised in the field, so they're not getting the academic advice that they require. Expectations was a massive one. So when there was this disparity between what they expected the PhD experience to be like and then what it was actually like, they were left feeling sort of really kind of cross, really disappointed. Whether this is sort of marketing, whether this is the interview process or the supervisor, somewhere the expectation possibly not being made clear, and this is leading people to feel quite disappointed, like whether we need to be clearer from the outset what the experience is going to be like. I don't think you'll ever know what it's like until you do it yourself, but yeah, expectation setting is really, really crucial. However, I thought it was really poignant that one participant mentioned how this sort of constant narrative on sort of social media on poor mental health during the PhD experience really concerned them. And I think we're all guilty for it. And I love Twitter. I find it a really good support. But yeah, sharing memes, sort of funny memes about the sort of awful side of the PGR experience and the sort of stresses that entails, sometimes can sort of make people feel, oh God, is it sort of normalised that I will have poor mental health when I'm doing a PhD? There is a lot of negativity out there, which I think, can be quite true. Support, people needed support. It was a lonely experience, but yes, this emotional support from peers seemed to negate these feelings of isolation, and that is a lot of what my sort of interventions were kind of focused on, is really bolstering that peer support and emotional support. I think it's really important that peer support, for the university, peer support is great. They're like, that's fantastic, they can just support each other, that's free and cost effective, but it cannot, I think it's really, really important with peer support that obviously it's a big burden on the people providing the peer support in sort of mentoring schemes and things like that. So if the university is going to really try and bolster peer support, they need to give support to the people to support other people. They need training, they need payment if they're expected to be sort of peer mentors and things like that, and they need advice and support themselves, because it's an emotional and it is a burden, supporting other people too. Balance, this is all about work-life balance. people really struggled with their multiple responsibilities and setting acceptable boundaries. They're perfectionists often. And yeah, you know, with your PhD, if you take time off, it's not going to go away. As I've discovered, no one's going to do it for you. You are solely responsible for that. And yeah, it's really hard. It really is hard to take a break, and there's the sort of guilt involved in that. And high workload often prevented people engaging in professional development opportunities or exercise or peer support opportunities, because they just felt like they had too much work to do to take a break. And coping obviously really important, the ways people cope with stress, and you know, whether they engage in wellbeing activities, you know, the way people cope with stress really sort of is really important. Resilience and coping in the way that we deal with the stresses in our life can be in a healthy way or an unhealthy way. But I found it interesting that quite a few use this sort of metaphor of reaching a breaking point. So this person said, you know, how do people without strong coping mechanisms actually, you know, cope with these situations? And this person's like, I've learned where my breaking point is. And the final person there said, you know, I think that everyone that does a PhD has a make or break point. So in terms of limitation for this paper particularly, was maybe something that a lot of you have found is the sort of, you know, self-selection bias can be really common in mental health research, but especially because my survey, I did have, I called it PGR, mental wellbeing, so it had that connotation with mental health and wellbeing, and yeah, my study sample was really female biased with females completing it. But there is some evidence that men are less likely to engage in these kind of this kind of research related to mental health and well-being, whereas if terms like strength and happiness are used, they're more inclined to take part. So I found that quite interesting. But also, you know, I did attract people, whether it's my own social networks, mostly from sort of social sciences disciplines and psychology, which can be more sort of female biased too. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear if any others have found this this kind of bias in their samples too, in their research. So that was kind of a whistle-stop tour. I hope you found it interesting, and yeah, I'd love your questions if you have any. Ooh.
Cool. That was great. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Yeah, so I'll pass it back to the group for questions. People can see the chat, feel free to pop a message in there, or if you want to raise your hand, and we can get started. I see Becky's got her hand up.
Yeah, I don't think I can see the chat, Hope, so you'll have to let me know if anything's in there.
No problem, I'll read them out.
Oh.
Thank you, Chloe. That was super good. And it sounds like it's all coming together. So congrats. It was just, I found it so interesting.